Hello. I recently spent a few days in the historic city of York, the capital of Yorkshire. This was in February of 2016. I had visited York previously, once in 1971, but that was only for a day when I was in the north of the country visiting relatives. And the second time was in 1992, when I went up there for work reasons. But this was really the first chance I'd ever had to look around the city proper and enjoy myself and relax. The city was still recovering from some serious flooding that had occurred over the Christmas period. There are two rivers that flow through York, the Foss and the Ouse, and I believe it was the smaller of the rivers, the Foss, that had caused the main problems on this occasion. There was still a little bit of clearing up to do, and a couple of places that were closed, but by and large, the city was back to normal when I visited. York is Britain's third most visited city after London and Edinburgh, and it is a very attractive place to visit. There's a large amount of the city wall still surviving, although it has to be said that that is largely a Victorian repair and reconstruction of it. But the Victorians put in place a walkway so that you can actually walk around a lot of the city wall, and get good views down into the town and out into the surrounding area. A lot of the city gates, which are called bars, still survive. Because of the Viking inheritance in York, the streets are often called gates and the gates are called bars. And the only part really that is missing from the surrounding city wall is where the railway line was built in the 19th century. But otherwise, there's a sort of circle of walls enclosing the old city centre. So it's retained a lot of its medieval street plan and its sort of oldie-worldy atmosphere. And as I say, it's a very attractive city. The centre itself doesn't have any high-rise buildings or big shopping precincts or anything like that, so it's retained a lot of its historic character. I spent 4 nights in York, so I had 3 whole days to explore, one of which was absolutely rain-sodden, but the other 2 days were very good weather. But there are plenty of places to visit indoors, to keep out of the bad weather, and I'll go into those in a little bit more detail a bit later. In the very centre of the town is this castle area. This is known as Clifford's Tower. It's built on a Norman Motte and Bailey arrangement. This is what the whole area would have looked like back in the Middle Ages, but only Clifford's Tower, which you can see on the left there, now survives. The rest of the castle area was destroyed in the 18th century and replaced with prisons and administrative buildings. But there's a lot of medieval and even earlier architecture in the town. This is the remains of an abbey, St Mary's Abbey, which was destroyed in Tudor times during the dissolution of the monasteries. These ruins are actually in the middle of a nice park area called the Museum Gardens, which is Nice place to stroll around and get a little bit of fresh air beside the river. There's still quite a lot of very narrow medieval lanes. This is the famous Shambles, which used to be a sort of area where there were lots of butchers' shops, and the street was lined with offal and various byproducts of the butchery trade. But the main dominant building in York is, of course, York Minster, which is the only tall building on the skyline. It's a magnificent building and well worth a visit, and one of the many places that you can get indoors if the weather is bad. Costs, I think it was £10 admission, but that will allow you readmission for a year, and you can pay another £5 for a trip to the top of the tower, which is just a one-off ticket. Fantastic stained glass window at one end, and magnificent architecture, as I said. This is the King's Screen, which shields off the sort of choir area, and it depicts all the monarchs from William the Conqueror up to I think it's Henry IV. That is meant to be William the Conqueror, believe it or not. I'm sure that's not an accurate portrayal of what he looked like, but a sort of medieval concept. It's a very steep, winding staircase to get up onto the tower roof. You get a break halfway where you have to come out and go along this, what would it be called, a transept, I think. So this is about halfway up, but it gives you the opportunity to see the outside of the building at closer range. And these are some of the views from the very top. You can see right out to the Yorkshire Dales, and you can look down on the actual city of York, the medieval street plan. As you can see, there's nothing to compete with the cathedral in terms of height. I think that building is the Dean's house, but I wouldn't like to swear to it. You can see a bit of the city wall there. back inside looking up at the roof. I've mixed up a lot of these clips, but this is obviously on the day where it rained quite hard. So I'm afraid some of the footage like this has got a lot of raindrops on the lens. I was told these buildings are the oldest in York, the oldest surviving buildings in York. This is Bootham Bar, which is the northern gate of the city. And this small church just beside the minster is where Guy Fawkes was baptised. He was born just over to the right of the picture. This is a Victorian memorial to the dead of the Boer War, the South African War. Now, underneath the medieval city are the remains of Roman York. York was an extremely important city in Roman times, and the 9th Legion were garrisoned here, which I'll talk about a lot more later. Constantine, the emperor who converted the Roman Empire to Christianity, was actually pronounced emperor in the city of York. So there's this modern statue of him outside the York Minster. There's not actually much to see of Roman York, but there are that's part of the Roman wall there, the red layer, and these are all Roman sarcophagi that were disturbed during the building of the railway. So that's what you can see on the outside of York's buildings, but now I want to talk a little bit about the museums and art galleries and exhibitions and so on that you can see that are all indoors. Right now, first of all, I have to say there were a lot of places that I didn't visit, most noticeably York's famous Railway Museum, which I think is the National Railway Museum, which I'm sure is an excellent display, but I partly I didn't have time, partly I'm not that interested in railways. I do like steam trains and so on, but I had higher priorities, shall we say. There's also the famous Jorvik Centre, which is an exhibition displaying the Viking heritage in York, and is sort of built over an archaeological site that was uncovered, I think, in the 70s or 80s. And its main feature is a reconstruction of Viking York with all the sights and smells that you might have experienced there. And you're taken on a little train ride through this reconstruction. But sadly, that was very badly damaged in the recent flooding because it's below ground level. And at the moment, that's closed, and there was no notification of when it might reopen at the moment. I have been to it. That was one of the places I visited in 1992. It's well worth a visit, but to be honest, it wasn't on my list of places to revisit. So even if it had been open, I probably wouldn't have gone back. But if you're new to York, definitely go to it. It's worth one look. And something else that I didn't explore or investigate is the chocolate heritage that York is proud of. There are a couple of major chocolate producers based in York, Rowntree's in particular, Terry's of York, and in the town centre there is, I think it's called the Chocolate Experience, which exhibits the history of chocolate making, and no doubt you can purchase and sample a lot of chocolate products. Sure, it's great fun. I just didn't have the time or the appetite to go there. So after that, there is the York Museums Trust, which run the three main museums in York, and you can purchase this card. I think this cost me £20, which will give you unlimited access to those three museums for a year. And they are the Art Museum, the Castle Museum, and the Yorkshire Museum. And of those three, I went in all three, but I didn't take any photographs in the art gallery. You are permitted to do so, and I asked about taking video photography as well, and said that wasn't. I was told that wasn't a problem, but it's an interesting gallery. I was a little bit disappointed by it because I was expecting it to have some more famous art than it actually did. There weren't any paintings that I recognised or was aware of. There are some very good paintings in there, but nothing to parallel the art galleries in places like Manchester, for instance. So I was a little bit disappointed by that, simply because I expected a prosperous city like York to have obtained over the years some slightly more prestigious artwork that had been handed on to it from private collections of local businessmen, but nothing like that in it. But in contrast to that, the Yorkshire Museum absolutely blew me away. I was so impressed by it. I went there not expecting a lot, and there was just so much in it. In particular, I wanted to see this inscription. It was the one thing that I knew was in the museum that I was interested in just taking a photograph of. Now, I know it may not look like much, but this absolutely fascinates me. Um, there's a mention on it of the Emperor Trajan, and it mentions his status as being the tribune of the people, which dates it to exactly 106 or 107 AD. And there is also on it a reference to the Ninth Hispana Legion, and that makes this inscription the last recorded reference to the Ninth Legion in history. And the Ninth Legion were an elite Roman legion. Originally, they're called Hispana because they were created in Spain, I think around 65 BC, and they are one of Rome's famous legions. They fought under Julius Caesar and took part in the conquest of Britain. And their last known garrison town was York. And sometime in the beginning of the 2nd century, so after this inscription was created, they would simply disappeared from history. There's no further record of them anywhere. And there's been speculation ever since about what happened to the Legion. Where did they go? Were they defeated in battle and eliminated? Were they disgraced and broken up? Were they simply transferred to another part of the Roman Empire and there's just no reference to them? Historians just don't know. But the balance of opinion is probably that they were eliminated simply through the sheer number of losses that they incurred in fighting, either in one big disastrous battle or over the course of several years, having taken such great losses. To support that view, historians have pointed to a Roman historian called Fronto, who wrote about the great losses that the Roman army suffered at the hands of the Jews and the Britons early in the reign of the Emperor Hadrian, who became emperor in 117 AD. And there certainly was serious fighting going on in Palestine during that period, and probable fighting going on in sort of the northern Britain, southern Scottish area at around the same time. And the Ninth Legion being based in York, they would have been the legion that would have been sent to that fighting. Now, there is kind of counter argument to that there's a will to describe a major loss of a Roman legion in Britain to kind of parallel the battle that took place in the Teutoburg forest during the reign of Augustus in Germany, where the German tribes eliminated a Roman legion. And this is simply a desire on the part of British historians to create a similar victory of the native tribes in their own country, and it's up for grabs really how you want to regard it, but it's a fascinating story. In the 19th century, there was an eagle excavated in Silchester, and that prompted a, a writer called Rosemary Sutcliffe to write a novel called The Eagle of the Ninth, and she surmised that this eagle was the um, recovered eagle of the Ninth Legion, and wrote a book that the later film The Eagle, which you may have seen, is based on. It's a good film to watch if you haven't seen it, but it's pure fiction, based on fiction itself, because the eagle that was recovered in Silchester, which is now in the Reading Museum, isn't now thought to be a legionary eagle or standard. But it is just a huge mystery that maybe one day something will be found. But the supposition is that the Ninth Legion marched into Scotland and didn't come back, and that then the Emperor Hadrian decided that the Roman expansion had gone far enough, and built the wall which is named after him, Hadrian's Wall, across the frontier with Scotland. But you would think, as the loss of the Roman legions in Germany were documented, why not the loss of a legion in that way in Scotland? But equally, why is there no mention of the legion anywhere else? There are plenty of other bits and pieces in the museum mentioning the Ninth Legion, but nothing that can have an accurate date attributed to it, such as that inscription on the wall that was once above a gate. So, because the legions were used to build so much, they put their mark on virtually everything. But as I say, the last known date is about 107 AD, and then they simply disappear. There are a lot of other Roman artifacts in the museum as well, that are worth taking a look at. Interestingly, though, I saw a program on telly some years ago about some bones that had been recovered, that were thought to belong to gladiators, because they had various marks on them, such as tooth marks from wild animals and so on. But I didn't find those anywhere in York. Maybe they're not on display yet. But anyway, there's a large Roman-related wing to the museum, but that's not all by far. So what I found was that the museum contains masses of stuff dating right up to the Middle Ages. So loads of Anglo-Saxon stuff, such as this helmet that was found in York, bits and pieces of jewellery, weaponry such as a sword, loads of really interesting things in there to do with the Dark Age period. And then, of course, York was a massive town in the time of the Vikings, who occupied it, and the museum covers finds from right the way across the county. So there are loads of hoards that have been found as well, hoards of treasure and silver and so on. These shots are all of a hoard of silver that was discovered at Bedale in Yorkshire. There's lots of sort of silver work, but also just bits and pieces of silver ingots with nicks in them, where people have obviously tested the quality of the silver over the course of time. This is some sort of chalice that was found in a Viking hoard that's been converted into a drinking bowl. And this is a hoard of Anglo-Saxon silver coins. and silver ingots. The coin just above the tip of that silver ingot, more or less in the centre of the picture, has the head of Alfred the Great on it. A hoard like this was probably buried in order to preserve it from a Viking raid, and then never recovered. The owners probably killed, and the hoard forgotten about. And then there were lots of bits and pieces from the Norman and early medieval period. Some of these pieces are taken from a shrine to St William of York that was demolished during the Reformation, and then the pieces were buried and forgotten about. Then after that there was a room that contained items from the late medieval period and the Wars of the Roses. I think that's Henry IV on that coin. Not entirely sure, I can't remember now, but lots of items like that. And this was the thing that absolutely impressed me about this museum, that everything in it was so understated. I had no idea that it had so much in it, or so much of importance. And in particular, there was this artifact here. Now, I've wanted to see this item for ages. I'd always imagined that it was in the British Museum. I had absolutely no idea that it was in the Yorkshire Museum in York. What it is it's called the Middleham Jewel. It was found by a metal detectorist in 1985, somewhere close to Middleham Castle, and there's a little bit of controversy about that, because had it been found within the grounds of the castle itself, it would have belonged to the owner of the castle, but it's public property now because it was found supposedly outside of the castle precinct. It's a reliquary, if I can say that properly, because it opens up. The panel at the back slides open, and it contains some fragments of silk, which were presumably thought to be holy relics. And it is extremely high status, so it would have been worn by a lady of importance, and being Middleham Castle, which was one of the seats of the House of York, it was probably worn by a queen or a woman of high status belonging to the House of York. So the wife of Richard III, for instance, or Elizabeth Woodville, possibly, who knows? But as I say, I was just completely gobsmacked to see it. There's no pretense about the thing. It's just there in a case, hardly signposted at all. And I was talking to one of the museum staff, and he was talking about the Middleham Duel and then just pointed it out behind me. I was completely blown away. Um, I've looked it up since, and apparently the museum paid £2.5 million for it, which gives you an idea of its value and its importance. And there it is, just standing on its own in a little side cabinet in the museum. There's also this ring, which is called the Middleham Ring. I'd never heard of this before, but it's another highly decorated ring of great value. And there are one or two interesting livery badges dating from the period of the Wars of the Roses, which were worn to demonstrate your allegiance to a particular household. And there's a skeleton that was recovered from the battlefield at Towton. It was buried along with two other skeletons, so not in a mass grave. And the length of the body is about 6'1", so it was probably a person of high status. But if I just show you the side of the skull again, so you might be able to make out there a sort of linear mark going from more or less in the center of the picture, going from, what would that be, 10 o'clock down to 4 o'clock. I've just put a little temporary arrow pointing at it there. And what that is a sort of scratch mark, an incision mark left by a sharp bladed instrument that was caused at the time of death, so it didn't get a chance to heal, and it's the mark of where the body has been mutilated, in that the ear has been cut off, and there were no marks on the arms indicating any kind of defensive action on the person's part. So he probably had his hands tied behind his back and was mutilated at the time of death. And then I was about to give this section a miss, and I'm glad I didn't. Look at this as a spectacular example of a fossil. It's a huge ichthyosaur, so a sort of Loch Ness monster type creature. I think this was found on the coast at Whitby. Whitby's sort of famous for its fossils, but superb, and again really sort of understated. It's just there to be seen as you go by. That's Archaeopteryx fossil. If that's an original and not a copy, then they're extremely rare. I think there are only about 11 in existence. There are various other bones of mammoths and so on. But I thought the Yorkshire Museum was absolute gem, absolute fantastic museum, and it's well worth a visit. That I think it's the best thing York has to offer. I found that, and I think there was an awful lot that I missed. I don't think I managed to go around everything, or else that they keep some of their items in storage and don't display everything. Because having looked up things on the internet since, there are a lot of things that I either missed or aren't on display at the moment. So well worth a visit. The third establishment run by the York Museums Trust is the York Castle Museum, which is based in the 18th century buildings that were built on the site of the old medieval castle. So this is a view of the museum entrance down from the top of Clifford's Tower, which is the medieval tower that I showed you earlier in this film. Now, even though it's run by the same trust, they have a different policy regarding video photography in this museum, in that they don't allow it. They only allow still photography, and the lighting in it in there is quite poor, very dark. So I haven't got a great deal in the way of images to show you. It basically picks up where the Yorkshire Museum leaves off. So it starts from around the 17th century, and the items in it are really mainly related to domestic and social history. So things like they have a series of rooms showing you the decorations and furniture and so on from various periods in history. They have a mock-up of a Victorian street um, with all the shop windows filled with various items, and barrel organs and hackney cabs on cobbled streets and so on, that you can walk around and imagine yourself back in Victorian times. Um, because it occupies some of the buildings that were once used as the debtors' prison and the female prison, there's a whole section related to incarceration and crime and punishment and transportation and so on. Yeah, I'm sounding less enthusiastic than I was about the Yorkshire Museum, because it didn't have as much in it to excite me, I have to be honest. And I didn't come away with a great many even still images to show you. And the one thing that I was sort of disappointed with is that I was expecting somewhere in York to find some exhibits and displays to do with the Civil War, because York was besieged during the Civil War, and one of the major battles of the war, Marston Moor, took place about 9 miles away from York. But apparently there was a display to do with Marston Moor in here, but it was removed about a year ago and replaced with an exhibition to do with the Great War. And that was certainly the display that I found the most interesting thing in the museum, but it was very generic and little to do with York itself, and a bit of a mishmash of items. I can show you a few of the photographs I took in there that of things that took my drew my attention, but it will show you what I mean. So there's a section relating to naval warfare during the Great War. This is a Victoria Cross, so I was interested in this because I noticed that the ribbon is blue, and I always thought the ribbon for the Victoria Cross was crimson, which it is, but apparently up until 1918, any recipients who were in the Navy had a dark blue ribbon. So that was just a little fact I picked up. But as far as I can see, there's no relationship between this Victoria Cross and Yorkshire. I forget who won it. I'm afraid I've forgotten. But another example is this map here. Now, I'm afraid you can't make this out very well, but what it is, it's a hand-drawn map of the engagement that took place between HMAS Sydney, so that was an Australian ship, and the SMS Emden, which was a German surface raider. And the Sydney was pursuing the Emden in the Pacific and sank it in an engagement at the Cocos Islands. But again, I can see absolutely no bearing on Yorkshire. I just don't understand what it's doing there. I'm particularly interested in it because I am interested in the history of the Emden and the whole campaign that took place with Graf Spey's fleet and so on in the First World War. So it drew my eye, but I can't understand the point of it being on show in an exhibition relating to the First World War in a Yorkshire museum. It's just lost on me. And if you were to ask me what I thought would be relevant, well, what comes to mind when I think of the Navy and the First World War in Yorkshire is the German raid on the east coast of England in 1914, and the German fleet shelling, I think it was Whitby, Scarborough, and Hartlepool. And I think there are a few photographs of that, of damaged buildings, but not a great deal, and very kind of hidden away. And so it went on really. You sort of walked down a mock-up of a World War One trench, and there were German uniforms and British uniforms and gas masks and machine guns and examples of medical practices and bandages and x-rays and so on, and medals such as these. I don't know. I forget. It wasn't terribly inspiring, and it was really kind of unenergetic, as though they'd been told they had to put something on related to the centenary of the Great War, and they just fished out any artifacts they could find. And I mean, a map of a battle that took place in the Pacific between an Australian and a German ship just about sums it up, really. That was how relevant it was to the history of York and Yorkshire. So I didn't really rate the Castle Museum very highly, I'm afraid. It had barely changed since I'd last visited it in 1992, and I think they're basically overburdened with too much clutter, and they need to empty the place out and start again. I was a lot more impressed by this place, which is the York Army Museum, which is on the opposite side of Clifford's Tower from the Castle Museum. So it's only a short walk from the Castle Museum. And it's a small museum relating to the various regiments that are based in York, but well worth having a look round. I'll just show you a few of the artifacts in here that I thought were really appealing. So this is the actual helmet that was worn by General Scarlett at the charge of the Heavy Brigade at the Battle of Balaclava. So obviously the charge of the Light Brigade at Balaclava is much better known. But prior to that charge, the Heavy Brigade had made a successful charge against the Russian cavalry, and you can actually see there the indentation where he took a blow to the head from a Russian saber, which I think is fantastic. And these are some of the possessions of Captain Oates, who was with Scott on his ill-fated expedition. This is a Napoleonic cavalry helmet, and one dating from the 1820s. There's a really outrageous sort of pom-pom on it. This is a mock-up of a cavalryman from the Great War. This is a Napoleonic infantryman's uniform. This is a cavalry standard that was carried at the Battle of Dettingen, which I think it's 1745, can't remember. But it's thought to be the oldest surviving cavalry standard in Britain. This is some silk that was cut from Napoleon's camp bed after the Battle of Waterloo. And there's a lot more in there as well. I've just shown you a little bit, things that I thought were quirky or interesting. It's a fraction of the size of the Castle Museum, and obviously entirely related to military history, but far more in there, I think, of interest than there is in the Castle Museum. So, well worth a visit. Now, you can pay to go inside Clifford's Tower and walk around the top of it. It's run by English Heritage rather than the York Museums Trust, so you have to pay a separate entrance fee, which is a little bit pricey for what you get. It's about £4.50, and it's really just an empty shell there, with some fairly good views over York itself, but obviously not as good as the views from the top of York Minster, which costs £5 to go up. But if you're stuck for things to do, yeah, go up it. You can see a few of the rivers in better detail that flooded during the recent floods, but that's sort of borderline. Go up it if you're stuck for things to do, basically. But there are two places that I'd recommend you definitely avoid. There are two little displays taking place. One is in this bar here, Micklegate Bar, and the other one is in Monk Bar. This one houses the Henry VII experience, and the Monk Bar houses the Richard III experience. I think it costs £5 to get into both as a joint ticket, and there's very little even worth looking at. Few little mock-ups of Wars of the Roses battles, but not particularly well done, and it's probably a good place to take a kid on a rainy day. Some helmets they can try on, so on, but they're a waste of money in my opinion, and I don't know how much longer they'll be there. But it's a great shame because Richard III has only recently been reburied in Leicester Cathedral, and York is very upset that he wasn't buried in their Minster. But they haven't put much of a case on in if they were interested in getting his body moved to York. They should have found a lot more items of interest to put in these exhibitions, I think, and it's just an excuse to sort of cash in on the recent sort of Richard III appeal. But I'd say stay away from both of those two exhibits. So there we are. That's my impressions of the city of York. I had a fantastic time there. It's a really great place to visit, and I didn't get to see the Railway Museum or go to the Jorvik Museum because that was closed due to flood damage. I certainly intend going back to York, and next time I go, I might sort of go at a different time of year and then take some trips out into the surrounding area. So places like Castle Howard, the famous stately home close by, and so on. There's plenty to see and do in York. But number one favourite for me is the Yorkshire Museum. That is just a mine of interesting history and interesting items. So if you've got one place to go in York, go to that first of all. So thanks for watching, and please comment, please like and subscribe if you haven't done so already, and I'll see you on the next video. Bye for now.